The, quote, unknown, end quote, reality. Volume 2 of a Seth book by Jane Roberts. Notes and introduction by Robert F. Butts. Read by Martin John. Beginning Section 4. Session 705, June 24, 1974, 9:09 p.m., Monday. Good evening. Let us begin this section with a brief discussion concerning, quote, evolution. For now, think of it as you usually do, in a time context. It has been fashionable in the past to believe that each species was oriented selfishly toward its own survival. Period. Each was seen in competition with all other species. In that framework, cooperation was simply a byproduct of a primary drive toward survival. One species might use another, for instance. Species were thought to change and, quote, mutant form because of a previous alteration in the environment to which any given species had to adjust or disappear. The motivating power was always projected outside. See Appendix 12. All of this presented a quite erroneous picture. Physically speaking, Earth itself has its own kind of Gestalt consciousness. If you must, underlined, then think of that Earth consciousness as grading, Grading, upward in great slopes of awareness from relatively, quote, inert particles of dust and stone through the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. Even then, remember that those kingdoms are not so separate after all. Each one is highly related to each of the others. Nothing happens in one such kingdom that does not affect the others. A great, gracious cooperation exists between those seemingly separate systems, however. If you will remember that even atoms and molecules have consciousness, then it will be easier for you to understand that there is indeed a certain kind of awareness that unites these kingdoms. In your terms, consciousness of self did not develop because of any exterior circumstances in which your species won out, so to speak. In fact, that consciousness of self in any person is dependent upon the constant, miraculous cooperations that exist between the mineral, vegetable, and animal worlds. Footnote 3. The inner intent always forms any exterior alteration. This applies on any scale you use. Consciousness forms the environment. The environment itself is consciousness, all forcefully. Atoms and molecules themselves operate in their own fields of probabilities. In their own ways, they, quote, yearn toward all probable developments. When they form living creatures, they become a physical basis for species alteration. The body's adaptability is not simply an adjusting mechanism or quality. The cells have inner capabilities that you have not discovered. They contain within themselves memory of all the, quote, previous forms they have been a part of. I would like to make an aside here. In certain terms, you cannot destroy life by a nuclear disaster. You would, of course, destroy life as you know it, and in your terms bring to an end, if the conditions were right or wrong, life forms with which you are familiar. In greater terms, however, mutant life would emerge, mutant only by your standards, but life quite natural to itself. To return to our main subject of the moment. The fact is that the so-called process of evolution is highly dependent upon the cooperative tendencies inherent in all properties of life and in all species. There is no transmigration of souls, underlined, in which the entire personality of a person, quote, comes back as an animal. Yet in the physical framework, there is a constant intermixing, so that the cells of a man or a woman may become the cells of a plant or an animal, footnote 4, and of course vice versa. The cells that have been a part of the human brain know this in their way. Those cells that now compose your own bodies have combined and discombined many times to form other portions of the natural environment. This inner and yet physical transmigration of consciousness has always been extremely important and represents a natural method of communication, uniting all species and all physical life. Inside all physical organisms, therefore, there is a thrust for development and change, even as there is also a pattern of stability within which, all underlined, such alterations can take place. Give us a moment. Historically, of course, you follow a one-line pattern of thought. So you see a picture in which fish left the oceans and became reptiles. From these mammals eventually appeared and apes and men. That is, I admit, a simple statement, but it is the way most people think evolution occurred. The terms of, quote, progression are tricky. You never imagine the situation being reversed, all underlined, for example. Few of you ever imagine a conscious reptilian man. It seems to you that the direction you took is the only direction that could have been taken. Give us a moment. You identify a highly evolved self-consciousness with your own species development and with your own kind of perceptive mechanisms. You apply these as rules or conditions whenever you examine any other kind of life. In your system of probabilities, there are no reptilian men or women, yet in other probabilities they do indeed exist. I mention this only to show you that the evolutionary system you recognize is but one such system. intently, and all underlined. The physical basis rests latently within your own cellular structure, however. You think that evolution is finished. Its impetus, however, comes from within the nature of consciousness itself. It always has. In some quarters, it is fashionable these days to say that man's consciousness is now an element of a new kind of evolution. But that, quote, new consciousness has always been inherent. You are only now beginning to recognize its existence. Every consciousness is aware of itself as itself. Footnote 5. Each consciousness, then, is self-aware. It may not be self-aware in the same way that you are. It may not reflect upon its own condition. On the other hand, it may have no need to. Give us a moment. The so-called future development of your species are now dependent upon your ideas and beliefs. This applies genetically in personal terms. For instance, if you believe that you can live a healthy and happy, all underlined, old age, well into your 90s, then even in Western civilization, you will do so. Your emotional intent and your belief will direct the functioning of your cells and, emphatically, all underlined, bring out in them those properties and inherent abilities that will ensure such a condition. There are groups of people in isolated places who hold such beliefs, and in all such cases the body responds. The same applies to the race or the species, to be more exact. There is an inexhaustible creativity within the cells themselves that you are not using as a species because your beliefs lag so far behind your innate biological spirituality and wisdom. Your ideas are beginning to change. But unless you alter your framework, you will continue to emphasize medical and technological manipulation. Period. In isolated cases, this will show you some of the results possible, underlined, on a physical basis alone. However, such techniques will not work in mass terms, or allow you, say, to prolong effective, productive life unless you change your beliefs in other areas also, and learn the inner dynamic of the psyche. Take your break. It is true, then, that the cells do operate on the one hand apart from time, and on the other with a firm basis in time, so that the body's integrity as a time-space organism results. It is true that on a conscious level you do not as yet operate outside of time, but are bound by it. When you learn to free yourselves from those dimensions to some extent, you are not simply duplicating or, quote, returning to some vaster condition, but adding a new element to that condition. The kind of self-awareness you have is, underlined, unique, but all kinds are unique. Each triumph you make as an individual is reflected in your species and in its cellular knowledge. Give us a moment. In a way, you are all your own mutants, creatively altering cellular formations. Period. When your fate seems dependent upon heredity, for example, then the transmission of ideas and beliefs operates. These give signals to the chromosomes. They cause miniature self-images, so to speak, that are mirrored in the cells. In many cases, these images can be altered, but not with the technology you have. Give us a moment. Basically, cellular comprehension straddles time. There is, then, a way of introducing, quote, new genetic information to a so-called damaged cell in the present, footnote 6. This involves the manipulation of consciousness, basically, and not that of gadgets, as well as a time reversal principle. First, the undesirable information must be erased. It must be erased in the, quote, past in your terms. Some, but very few, psychic healers do this automatically without realizing what they are doing. The body on its own performs this service often when it automatically writes certain conditions, even though they were genetically imprinted. The imprints become regressive. In your terms, they fade into a probable series of events that do not physically affect you. End of dictation and end of session 705. Peace, light, and love. Aloha, and thank you for listening.